gradually evolved from one with a nipple to one with a screw cap, you know. That could have been funny, but it wasn't, I guess. Jamison's, of course, right? My favorite, Jamison's orange, but I'm not asking. You know, that's just another thing. Interesting. But as I'm developing those understanding myself, I do need help from other people. And guess what? I think you're conscious, Doug, and I think you have a self-consciousness, right? And so two self-consciousnesses are interacting with one another. And, you know, I could make a funny sketch of this, you know, or, you know, like I could think of, you know, me going into a bar, you know, and going up to the, you know, the stool, and because they make the stools too high for me, I have to one cheek it, you know, because I can't really, you know, you don't want to sit with your feet going like this because you look like a kid, you know. But you know, if you're not tall enough, you have to kind of just sit on the edge, like, you know, I'm male, you know, and of course in comes the female, you know how they walk, you know, your baby here, right? You know how they do. And you think, aha, she's a self-consciousness, and I'm a self-consciousness, and I want to have a relationship with the self-consciousness. So I pretend to be as male as I think. You know, I try to imagine what she thinks I ought to be like, and I try to behave the way she would like. So I'm attracting her, and I'm aware that she's a self-consciousness that's thinking to herself, he's trying to fool me into thinking that he's, you know, right? You know, so you have this dialectical process evolving, step by step. And if you look at how he describes this, he says, self-consciousness is faced by another self-consciousness. It has come out of itself. In other words, while I'm trying to imagine what she is like, I'm not me right now. I'm putting myself into her mind, what I imagine to be her mind, right? So I've come out of myself. Where am I here? I got lost. It has come out of itself. This has a twofold significance. First, it has lost itself, for it finds itself as another being. I'm her, thinking about what is she thinking, right? Secondly, in doing so, it has superseded the other, for it does not see the other as an essential being, but in the other sees its own self. So I'm not really seeing her thinking of herself. I've superseded that, because now I'm thinking, my thinking that she's thinking this is what I'm experiencing in my relationship with her, right? It must supersede this otherness of self. This is the supersession of the first ambiguity, and is therefore itself a second ambiguity. So it gets more complex as we go, right? First, it must proceed to supersede the other independent being in order thereby to become certain of itself as the essential being. Secondly, in so doing, it proceeds to supersede its own self, for this other is itself. Now, this kind of dialectical process sounds absolutely like garbage unless you figure out, wait a minute, what he's trying to describe is this constant interaction in a particular case, you know, and by the way, in this particular case, it's kind of a model for all cases. So not only am I trying to interact and get to know this other person, but, you know, we can explore it in the sense of a speaker talking to a room full of people. He's imagining, what does my audience want? You know, and trying to put his mind into that and trying to be what that audience wants, right? Or it could be two whole groups of people, each of them trying to imagine what the other wants. I mean, when we look at the war in Gaza right now, that's, you know, you watch the news and what you see is these people arguing past one another over what Gaza is doing with the people in Gaza, while it's Hamas versus the Gazans, et cetera, the Palestinians. versus Israel, well, of course it's much more complex. You can't just say Israel wants this, because it's a whole society that's at war with itself in a sense, right? Gaza is clearly at war with itself. So it's much more complex, but we do, in a way, think of it as a consciousness. Israel has a consciousness. The United States has a consciousness. What is our world soul? Is there such a thing as a world soul of the United States right now? It's too complex really to say that the president represents us the way Napoleon kind of represented the French Revolution, right? So you've got a Weltgeist, which is the whole world's spirit, and it's contentious, obviously.
Isn't there a Volkgeist as well, and Zeitgeist?
A Zeitgeist would be the spirit of the time.
Yeah, spirit of the time, and then Volkgeist.
Volkgeist would be the Volk, right?
Yeah, wouldn't that be more applicable to, like, let's say, instead of saying the Weltgeist of America, it would be Volkgeist of America?
Or, well, when I think of the Weltgeist, I think of, the entire human societies all interacting with one another.
Yeah, that's what I think.
And it's contentious because it's a much more complex version of the bar scene, where you're trying to interact. We've got all these people interacting with other people and so on. But what you see, though, is that this dialectical process is how all of this works, and we get an evolution. The easiest way of describing the dialectic is to say that you've got a stasis, a situation, right? And then, or a thesis, another way of talking about it. The current situation is the thesis. And then out of that, automatically comes this antithesis.
Yeah, the negative.
And as a result of the conflict between the thesis and the antithesis, it evolves to a synthesis, right? Where you've got kind of a new thesis. And then, of course, it doesn't just sit there. That's not the way nature works. Everything just keeps on moving, right? So that you've got another antithesis that arises and naturally is in conflict with that thesis. And that moves on to the next synthesis, right? And so you get this interesting pattern of how things work. And we still think this way. By the way, Darwin's evolution is just this whole process in biological terms, which would have not been something that Hegel would have imagined, right? Hegel didn't get into biology that much. I mean, the basics of the day, but he obviously wasn't into evolutionary theory the way we see with Darwin. And by the way, evolutionary theory has been evolving. So it's not just Darwin, of course, but our contemporary versions of this are all dialectical. The different aspects of the creatures that are involved in an environment have to interact with the environment. You get this dialectical process that goes on. The way society changes, right? We'll see is this dialectical process, and it's very complex. You can't just describe it in like black and white descriptions of things, because each individual is a self-consciousness that's growing and maturing and interacting with others around it and developing, etc. Right? So you can see it's a very complex philosophy this way, and yes, it does throw a lot of people because of the way he describes it. You have to use your imagination to figure out that he's talking about a flow of actions that might not be exactly the same all the time, but basically, for me to have a self-consciousness, I have to be aware of myself as a self, which I think of as a constant process. I'm constantly involved in trying to change that. So you see the way he interprets what the structure is, and I neglected to mention, all the different languages are part of this. It's a minor aspect of what he's looking at, but certainly today we definitely think of that as an issue. When we're trying to think, what kind of self-consciousness can a person have? Do they have one? It's pretty clear that some cultures have not gone through these stages And the culture itself has to go through the stage in order for the individuals in that culture to go through those stages themselves. And if the culture itself hasn't progressed through these various stages, I'm thinking Afghanistan. They won't even let women get an education. And by the way, the education for men isn't worth two shakes either, right? So when you think, what kind of modern self-consciousness might develop in a town like Kabul, it's horrible. And by the way, if you are, say, a woman who's been involved in an educational process, maybe even in Europe, and you've learned all this stuff, and you're back in that environment, and then of course the Taliban take over again, oh my goodness, what a horrific situation. I can't imagine the problem that consciousness would have in that situation, because they're mentally thinking in a modern sense, and they're in an environment where it's not allowed. Don't even let them know, that you're thinking like this, right? Is this fun? Is this too much of a... So what we'll see next class is, we'll do Mill, and Mill is now, clearly 20, 30, 40 years following this. This becomes part of the way society thinks in modern Europe. So this is our current way of looking at things. Is it complex? Yes. Are there lots of variants? Yes. And we're engaged in a process as well. So any questions? Is this fun? I find it fascinating. I was in trouble in college.
Oh.
When I got through these philosophers, I was just being beat to a pulp. But when I hit Hegel and I saw how this worked out, I was like, yes! Solution!
What was the quiz question?
The quiz question was regarding the world soul on a horse. Who was the world soul on a horse? Let's see if I can find it. There it is. First question is, what do you think Hegel means by Weltgeist? And who was the Weltgeist on a white horse? Napoleon. That's why we looked at the picture of Napoleon on a white horse in Jena.
Yeah?
Hegel standing there, kind of like greeting Napoleon. Wouldn't have happened. But I mean, that's, the picture, because famously Hegel saw Napoleon riding on his white horse, doing reconnaissance for the Battle of Vienna, which the Germans lost, by the way. And Hegel had to leave.